Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Anton Warnchuk in Baltimore. In recent weeks, as armed protesters took over government buildings in the eastern regions of Ukraine, we were repeatedly told by U.S. officials that Russia has been behind all this, but there has been little offered behind their repeated assertions. Our next guest says the recent evidence trying to prove that Russian soldiers were among the armed protesters is bogus and is part of a propaganda stampede by media outlets who are concerned with promoting an anti-Russian bias. Now with us to discuss this is Robert Parry. Robert is a renowned investigative journalist and founder and editor of consortiumnews.com, and his recent piece is titled New York Times Retracts Russian Photo Scoop. Thanks for joining us, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
So Robert, the New York Times reported that the Ukrainian government had proof that Russian soldiers were behind the takeover of government buildings in eastern Ukraine. They released these photos to prove that Russia was behind these takeovers despite Russia's denial of involvement. Now the Times is backpedaling and saying that the photographs they printed are coming under scrutiny. What do you think is the significance of their retraction?
Well, it's always interesting when the New York Times goes with a front page story, a lead piece on Monday, citing these photographs as evidence, the sort of slam dunk evidence that Russian troops had gone into Ukraine and were essentially instigating this uprising in these 10 cities in eastern Ukraine. The New York Times presented these photographs, but apparently never really checked them out. The photographs themselves really didn't prove much. They basically, even if you were to accept them at face value, there are other explanations for why people might be in one place or another beyond the fact that they were sent there by the Kremlin. But as it turned out, that a key photograph that the Times used, a group photograph which the Times claimed had been taken in Russia, and then some of the same fighters show up in eastern Ukraine, that was presented as a key piece of evidence that these folks were from Russia and were participating in the eastern Ukrainian uprising. But it turned out that the photograph was actually taken by a freelance photographer in eastern Ukraine. So the whole basis of the Times story collapses because these folks were not photographed in Russia; they were photographed in eastern Ukraine, and that's what the Times was forced to retract today.
Well, you've worked at newspapers before, and you've seen that often they have to run corrections because they don't always get the story right. Couldn't some argue that this is just one of those instances?
Well, it's certainly an instance of getting something screwed up, but here we're talking about a possible confrontation involving the United States and Russia. This is not a joke. This is not some minor story where a journalist can be sloppy. Not that a journalist should ever be sloppy, but this is one where real lives are at stake. And the Times should have taken much more care in checking this material out. They were simply handed the material, apparently by the U.S. government, although the interim government in Kiev was also peddling the same photographs. And the Times ran with them. They should have shown much more care and scrutiny before this, because this story, once it runs on the front page of the New York Times, is picked up by American news organizations across the media spectrum. Everyone runs with it as if it's true. And that creates an opinion amongst the American people that is not based on fact, but is based on this serious error. Now, it may be that there are Russians operating in eastern Ukraine. We don't really know. But this evidence doesn't support that. And in fact, it turned out in a key place to be wrong.
Now, it seems that if the U.S. really did want to go after Russia, that what they could do is point out some of the problems that maybe had the problems of the Crimea referendum. And I just read a McClatchy piece from a couple weeks ago that said that we haven't seen any sort of sophisticated or detailed voting analysis of the referendum, and that the amount of support that had been given to the referendum couldn't really have come with the boycotts of the Tatars and the Ukrainians within the region, So why would they go after the Russians this way with this kind of flimsy evidence instead of
Well,
poking
the,
at the
the U.S.
side
is
of?
going after the Russians on a whole variety of ways. This is not the only one. Um, and frankly, the way the U.S. government has behaved has been somewhat reckless in that it has been presenting a very one-sided narrative, ignoring some of the wrongdoing on the side of the coup makers who overthrew the elected government in Ukraine, the Yanukovych government. That's what set off a series of events which Putin has been largely reacting to. There's been this other myth that's been going around official Washington that Putin somehow masterminded this whole thing. But that's crazy because he didn't have anything to do with the Maidan demonstrations. He had nothing to do with the overthrow of Yanukovych. He was supporting Yanukovych. After that, there was a strong popular movement in Crimea, which has been historically part of Russia, to escape what was increasingly a failed state in Ukraine. Now, the referendum was done rather hastily, and there's legitimate criticism that it wasn't done with all the safeguards you'd like to see on an election. But I don't know anybody involved in this that doesn't believe that a majority of Crimeans favored getting out of Ukraine and joining Russia. It may not have been the high percentage that the vote showed, but most people I've talked to, pretty much everybody I've talked to, agrees that represented a popular feeling in Crimea, just because they had been always part of Russia, going back to the 1700s, and that they had real reason to be concerned about the chaos that was enveloping Ukraine. And there are practical things that, like their pensions went up by joining Russia. So I think the U.S. has been trying to create a case to make the Russians look as bad as possible, but it's not been an objective or honest one. And I think what happened with the New York Times going with this very sloppy story about these photographs is just another example of how that's worked.
Okay, Robert Parry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.